At 2:17 in the morning, the heart monitor of a dying special operations soldier went completely flat, and the only person in that room who didn't step back was the nurse everyone had already decided didn't matter. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't an officer. She wasn't anyone they'd bothered to learn the name of. She was the night shift nurse who refilled IV bags and charted vitals and stayed out of the way when the important people were working. But when that monitor screamed its single flat tone into the air of Bay 7, and the three physicians in the room each took one instinctive half-step backward, she moved forward. And when she leaned down close to that soldier's ear and whispered something in a language, nobody else in the room recognized something clipped and structured and spoken with the quiet authority of a person who had been trained once. In a world these doctors had never touched, something impossible happened. His eyes, the eyes of a man three separate physicians had already declared functionally brain dead, snapped open like a door kicked off its hinges. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The monitor, which had been flat, began to trace an erratic but undeniable rhythm. And in that silence, Nurse Marlo Voss looked up at the stunned faces around her and said, very quietly, "He's still in there. He has been this whole time." Before we go any further, if you're new here and you haven't subscribed yet, right now is exactly the moment to do it. Stories like this one don't go where you think they're going, and every part of this series moves somewhere the last part didn't prepare you for. Hit that subscribe button so you don't get left behind when the next episode drops. Smash the like button if this story already has you leaning forward. And drop a comment, I want to know the city and country you're watching from. Last time, people were watching from 6 continents. Let's see if we can reach all 7. Now, let me tell you about Marlo Voss. And the night she walked into a room full of people who had already decided she was invisible and proved every single one of them catastrophically wrong. Harwick Military Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Davenport, Oregon, which was the kind of city that existed mostly in the margins, not quite Portland, not quite anything with a name people recognized. Just a stretch of federal contracts and highway exits and one river that nobody fished in anymore. The medical center itself was fenced and badged and thoroughly unremarkable from the outside. Inside, it operated according to a hierarchy so rigid it showed up in the way people moved through the hallways. Doctors walked in the center of the corridor. Nurses moved to the sides. Orderlies pressed against the walls. And the patients, of course, didn't move at all. Marlo Voss had been working overnight shifts at Harwick for 11 months. Long enough to understand the hallways, long enough to stop expecting the hierarchy to change, but not quite long enough to stop noticing the particular way it pressed against her on certain nights more than others. She was 38 years old, white, with dark hair she kept cut short and tucked behind both ears, and the kind of face that people described as practical when they were being neutral and plain when they weren't. She had stopped caring about either description sometime during her second deployment. She'd spent 6 years in the Army before she became a nurse, 6 years that had taken her into contexts she'd signed papers agreeing never to discuss in unsecured environments, and somewhere in those 6 years she had shed whatever version of herself had needed to be perceived a particular way. What remained was functional. What remained was good at its job. Tonight the job had arrived at 1:43 a.m. in the form of a medevac transport, military markings, no advance notice, touching down on the Harwick roof pad with a patient whose condition the paramedic on board described in the intake form as multi-system crisis with atypical response indicators. 2 gunshot wounds, blunt head trauma of undetermined origin, oxygen saturation at 61% on arrival, blood pressure dropping, and one additional notation, written in red ink, underlined twice at the bottom of the form. Patient exhibiting paradoxical response to sedation. Marlo read that notation while she was still standing at the nurse's station, and she set the clipboard down and picked it up again. paradoxical response to sedation. That phrase had a specific meaning in general clinical practice. It described patients, usually pediatric or elderly, whose nervous systems reacted to sedatives with agitation rather than calm. Standard enough in certain populations. Unusual in a combat-decorated special operations soldier in his mid-30s who had otherwise presented with the physiology of a man in peak physical condition before whatever had happened to him happened. She knew one other context in which that phrase applied. She set the clipboard down again and went to go check on her other patients because she didn't have authority over Bay 7, and she wasn't going to be able to insert herself without a reason. She needed to watch first. She needed to be sure. The 3 physicians managing the case were already in motion by the time she positioned herself near the bay entrance. Dr. Fenwick Drall was the attending, a tall man with a habit of speaking in complete declarative sentences as though he were narrating his own decisions for a record. Dr. Sasha Oren was the trauma surgeon who had managed the initial stabilization, efficient and serious and not unkind, with the focused energy of someone who ran on caffeine and competence in roughly equal measure. And Dr. Marcus Bate had been called in specifically. Marlowe had never seen him on the floor before, which meant whatever this patient was, the hospital administration had considered him significant enough to warrant a specialist. The patient's name, according to the intake form, was Staff Sergeant Darian Kell. Marlowe had looked up that name while she was doing her other rounds, found nothing in the public record, which told her something in itself. She watched Drall order the first sedative push at 2 Fower A. M, and watched Darian Kell's response to it from full 12 feet away. His right hand, which had been resting loosely at his side, curled into a fist so controlled and deliberate that it bore no resemblance to the involuntary spasm of a man in neurological distress. His feet pressed flat against the mattress with measured, sustained force. The sound he made low, compressed, nothing like a groan, was the sound of a person managing pain through a technique, not reacting to it. That was not sedation failure. That was resistance. She watched Drall note the increased muscle activity and call for a higher dose and felt the back of her neck go cold. At 2:09, she was standing near the vitals cart, close enough to the bed to see what she needed to see, when she noticed it. His right index finger moving against the mattress surface with deliberate irregularity. Not tremor, not spasm, taps, intervals, grouped sequences with structure that didn't match any random neurological firing pattern she had ever observed. She watched it for 90 seconds to be certain. Then she walked to the nurse's station, sat down, took a blank sheet of paper, and started writing down what she'd seen. The memory she needed was 14 years old. It lived in the back of her mind with the specific quality of things learned under pressure, not organized, not clean, just true in the way that mattered. A small briefing room, an instructor who hadn't given his name, a whiteboard sequence. This is how they communicate when they can't communicate. Learn it. You may need to recognize it someday. She hadn't thought about it in over a decade. She wrote out the tap sequence she'd observed, cross-referenced it against the memory of that whiteboard, made 2 errors, backtracked, corrected. It took her 9 minutes. When she finished, she looked at what she'd written, and the cold that had started at her neck moved through her chest in a slow, specific wave. The sequence was a fragment, incomplete, with gaps. But the portion she could read was coherent, perimeter compromised. Hostiles present, do not confirm identity. Darian Kell believed he was a prisoner of war. He believed the hospital was an enemy facility. He believed the physicians treating him were interrogators working to extract information through chemical means. And every sedative push his bloodstream received was being interpreted by a combat-trained nervous system as a chemical attack, which explained exactly why his body was fighting it harder each time instead of surrendering to it. She stood up, took the paper, and walked back into Bay 7. "I need you to stop the sedation," she said. Drall turned around. Not the partial turn he'd given her the first time. This was full, complete, the kind of turn that meant she had finally said something that registered as requiring his attention. The expression on his face was not welcoming. "I beg your pardon?" The sedation is escalating his crisis response, not suppressing it. She kept her voice even, kept it clinical. She knew the second she sounded anything other than technical, she would lose them. He's exhibiting a paradoxical response because his nervous system is reading the medication as an attack. Each push is making the response stronger, not weaker. Dr. Oren looked up from the chart she was holding. "Nurse Voss, I know how this sounds." She held up the paper and set it on the nearest surface where they could see it. "I transcribed his finger movements over the last 9 minutes. This is a communication sequence. He's using a resistance protocol, a method of encoding messages during captivity that SRE-trained personnel learn to maintain under interrogation. He's not in neurological failure. He's in psychological lockdown. He thinks he's been captured." The room went quiet in a particular way. CSRE. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. The program that trained special operations personnel to survive captivity, to resist interrogation, to maintain operational security, even when their bodies were being broken. The training created physiological responses so deeply embedded that they activated involuntarily the body defending itself from perceived threat, even when the perceived threat was a medical team in an American hospital. Dr. Bate had not spoken yet. He crossed the room and looked at the paper she'd set down, and he looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her with the specific, evaluative attention of a man who had learned to take unexpected information seriously before deciding what to do with it. "Where did you learn to read that?" he asked. "I was Army," she said. 6 years. "I was attached to a special operations medical support program from 2009 to 2011. The program doesn't have a public designation." "Fort Kessler?" She met his eyes. "I'm not able to confirm the location in this setting." Bate held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Drawl moved between them with the energy of a man reasserting the organizational structure of the room. "This is a TBI patient in active hemodynamic deterioration. The treatment protocol has been established based on." "The treatment protocol is killing him," Marlowe said, and she didn't soften it because, at this point, softening it was a form of dishonesty she couldn't afford. "His oxygen saturation has dropped 6 points in the last 18 minutes. His blood pressure is falling because his entire musculature is in sustained defensive contraction. He is working against every intervention you're making because his brain has categorized you as the enemy. You cannot sedate your way through a SRE response. The training specifically prepares soldiers to resist chemical suppression. It is literally what they practice." Dr. Oren's expression had moved from skeptical to uncertain, which was progress. The monitor above the bed emitted 2 sharp tones. "Sat is at 52, Theo called from the far side of the room. He was the youngest nurse on shift, 4 months at Harwick, and he was watching this unfold with the expression of someone who had not yet decided what he was supposed to do with what he was seeing. BP 80/46, Oren said, moving toward the crash cart. "Give me 2 minutes with him," Marlowe said. Drawl said, "Absolutely not." 2 minutes, she said again, and this time she looked at Bate, not Drawl, because Bate was the one whose face still contained something that looked like active thought rather than committed position. "If nothing changes in 2 minutes, you do whatever you need to do. But if I'm right, and you push another sedative, you're going to code him, and you won't bring him back." Bate looked at the monitor, looked at Kell, looked at Marlowe. 2 minutes, he said. Drawl exhaled through his nose in a way that communicated his professional opinion of this decision with significant precision, but he did not countermand it. Marlowe pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down and leaned in close enough that her voice wouldn't carry to the back of the room. Close enough that he would hear her through whatever layered noise his brain was currently producing. She placed her hand over his fist, not restraining it. Just contact, the kind that established presence without threat, and she spoke in a cadence she hadn't used in 14 years, pulling it from a part of her memory she'd kept sealed. The net is down. All traffic is black. You're out of sector. Nothing happened. His fist stayed clenched. She tried another approach. Not classified content, she didn't have it and wouldn't have it, but structural. Contextual. The kind of detail that told a soldier this person had lived near the edges of his world and knew what that world felt like from the inside. You were medevaced from a compromised extraction point, she said quietly. I don't know the specifics of your operation, and I'm not asking for them. You have 2 gunshot wounds, both treated. You're in American territory, Davenport, Oregon, a federal military medical facility called Harwick. The people in this room are trying to keep your heart beating, not interrogate you. Your training is telling you this environment is hostile. Your training is wrong. His finger moved against the mattress. 1 tap, pause 2 taps, pause 1 tap. She read it. Prove it. The thing that moved through her chest was not quite relief. It was too complicated and too aware of what she still had to do to be relief. But he was listening. He was processing. He was there, behind everything his body was doing, still making decisions. She had to give him something to authenticate against. She didn't have the current countersign, whatever the active verification sequence was, for his unit. She was 14 years and several security clearance levels removed from it. But she knew enough of the shape of his world to build something real. I can't give you a current countersign, she said. My clearance lapsed in 2012. But I can tell you that I spent 2 years attached to a JSOC-adjacent medical program. I ran medical support for 3 integration exercises with DVGRU personnel, and I have personally observed the Stage 3 SERE response in a training context, which is how I know what you're doing with your hand and what it means. She paused. You've been in lockdown for approximately 16 hours. Your body has been at war with itself the entire time. The doctors in this room didn't know what was happening. I did. That's why I'm the one sitting next to you right now instead of them. His breathing shifted. Not calmer yet. Different. More deliberate, more controlled, with the quality of a person who was making a choice about their respiration, rather than just undergoing it. She kept going. Your training gave you a doorway out. It had to full lockdown with no exit criteria is a liability in the field, not an asset. I'm the exit criteria. I'm the person who knows the protocol exists, which is the minimum threshold for trust in a compromised environment. You don't have to believe I'm safe. You just have to believe I'm not the enemy. That's enough to let go of the response. Just that much. The silence that followed was perhaps 10 seconds. Then Darian Kell's fist opened, finger by finger, slowly. His hand flattened against the mattress surface and lay still. The oxygen saturation read 51. Then, in the next 20 seconds, 53, 55, 58. The sustained muscular contraction that had been compressing his chest cavity, restricting his lung expansion, limiting the mechanical function of his breathing, began to release. Not all at once, degree by degree, like a cable under tension, being slowly, carefully unspooled. His blood pressure began a slow climb, back towards something that could sustain a human being. By the time the saturation hit 63, Dr. Bate was standing directly behind Marlowe's chair. Keep going, he said, barely audible. 65. 67. She kept talking. Small things. Grounding things. The temperature of the room, the specific sound the monitor was making, the texture of the hospital blanket under his hand. Concrete details of the actual physical environment, building a map of reality over the map his training had installed. At 69% saturation, Darian Kell opened his eyes. They were dark brown and completely, unambiguously alert. They moved to her face with the immediate, focused precision of a threat assessment, not confused, not disoriented, not the glassy, unfocused gaze of a man surfacing from unconsciousness. He was measuring her, taking her apart, and categorizing the pieces. She held still, let him look. He looked at her for 5 full seconds. Then, you were Army. His voice was wrecked, hoarse, and abraded and lower than she'd expected, but the words were clear. 6 years, she said. What'd you do after? Nursing degree. Then this. His eyes moved around the room, slowly, deliberately, taking inventory. The monitors. The IV lines running into his arm. The physicians standing at the far edge of the bay with the stilled, careful posture of people who had just watched something they didn't have a category for. The security equipment on the walls, the civilian architecture of a medical facility rather than the tactical architecture of an enemy position. She watched him rebuild his understanding of where he was in real time. It wasn't clean. It wasn't smooth. She could see the effort it cost him, the way his jaw worked, and his eyes moved and his chest expanded carefully with each breath, as though he was testing whether the air was something he was allowed to have. Davenport, he said, yes. How long? You arrived at 1:43 a.m. It's just past 2:30 now. He processed that. Something moved across his face, not an expression. Exactly, more like the shadow of one, passing through and leaving the surface unchanged. My team, he said. The room behind her had gone so quiet she could hear the ventilation system. I don't have information about your team, she said. I'm sorry. I genuinely don't. He absorbed that, with the specific stillness of a person filing information under a category that would require processing later when the immediate crisis had finished demanding his full attention. His vitals monitor showed his heart rate at 88, holding the rhythm steady and functional, rather than the jagged, destabilizing pattern it had been tracking for the past 2 hours. Dr. Bates stepped forward and Marlowe moved to give him access to the bed, but Kell's eyes tracked her as she stood, and he said, without inflection, don't go far, and she stopped at the edge of the bay and stayed there. The next hour was controlled and methodical and costly in a way that only medical professionals understood the cost of recalibrating an entire treatment approach midstream, the specific professional discomfort of Drawl, accepting that the intervention he'd committed to had been wrong, the careful, quiet work of Orin reassessing the chest wound now that her patient was conscious and responsive. Marlowe charted vitals from the edge of the bay, answered questions when asked, and stayed clear of the center of the room where the work was happening. Drawl came and stood beside her at one point, around 3:15. He didn't look at her when he spoke. The saturation response, he said, was clinically notable. She waited. Your read of the situation was, he stopped. Reconsidered, selected a different word. Accurate. Thank you, she said. He nodded once, tightly, and walked away. It wasn't an apology. She hadn't expected one. It was a physician acknowledging, in the most compressed form available to him, that he had been wrong and she had been right, and, in the context of Fenwick Drawl at 3 a.m, after watching a tryst, nurse talk a dying man back from the edge, it was as close to generous as he was likely to get. By 4:15, Darian Kell had been stabilized and moved 2 floors up to a monitored room with military security personnel posted outside the door. The security detail was new. They hadn't been present when he arrived, and their appearance had been preceded by a series of phone calls that Marlowe hadn't been included in, but had observed from the corridor. Senior personnel, military bearing, the specific kinetic energy of people who had received information that required an immediate physical response. She finished her shift at 6, changed in the staff locker room, and was pulling on her jacket when Theo appeared in the doorway, with the expression of someone who had been awake for 8 hours and processed approximately 30 hours worth of experience. That was he started. Yeah, she said. The finger thing. How did you, I mean? Where does someone even learn to? Previous job, she said, which was true in the way that left everything important unsaid, and she picked up her bag and walked out. She took the long way home because she needed the cold and she needed to think, and what she thought about was not the medicine, not the confrontation with Drawl, not even the look on Bates' face, when the saturation monitor started climbing. What she thought about was what Darian Kell had said 20 minutes after his eyes opened. When his vitals were stable and Bate had stepped out to make phone calls and Oren was updating the chart, and the room had briefly, unusually, contained only the two of them. He'd said it looking at the ceiling, not at her, in the same flat and factual tone he'd used to confirm the city and the time. He'd said, "They knew we were coming." She had noted it, had logged it in the part of her mind that kept track of things that required further consideration. She had assumed, initially, that it might be residual confusion, a man rebuilding his coordinates after 16 hours of physiological crisis could be forgiven for reaching for explanation in men's that weren't fully formed yet. But the more she walked, the more she heard it again, and the clearer his eyes had been when he said it, and the more it refused to sit in the category of confusion. They knew we were coming. That wasn't disorientation. That was reporting. She walked the last 2 blocks to her apartment in the gray early light and let herself in and stood in her kitchen in her coat without turning on a lamp. And the silence of the apartment pressed in around her, and she thought about a special operations soldier with no public record who believed he had been ambushed by people who had known his team's position before they arrived. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the kitchen table. She did not sleep. She did not sleep, but she tried, because her body required the attempt even when her mind refused the result. She lay on top of her bed in her work clothes for 2 hours, with her eyes closed and her hands flat on her stomach and her brain running the same short loop on repeat, the flat line, the finger taps, the saturation climbing by single digits, and Darian Kell's voice wrecked and certain, saying, "They knew we were coming at the ceiling of Bay 7, Section 6-7, while she stood 6 feet away, pretending to chart vitals and understanding with increasing clarity that what he had said was not confusion." At 8:15 she gave up, showered, made coffee she didn't taste, and sat at her kitchen table with her phone face down and her hands wrapped around the mug and the morning light coming in flat and gray through the window over the sink. She went back to work at 6 the following evening. Nothing appeared to have changed. The hallways were the same hallways. The nurse's station smelled the same way it always smelled: antiseptic and burnt coffee, and something else underneath that she had never been able to name. Theo was on shift again, working a double, and he gave her a look when she came in that communicated an entire conversation's worth of unspoken material without either of them saying a word about it. "Anything?" she asked. His security detail doubled, Theo said quietly, not looking at her, adjusting a medication tray with careful nonchalance. "And there was a meeting this morning. Drawl, Bate, and 3 people from administration, none of us recognized. Lasted about an hour and a half. What came out of it? Nobody told us anything, obviously." He paused. "Kell's been asking for you." She had expected that, and she had also spent a portion of her 2 hours of not sleeping thinking about what it meant and what she intended to do about it, and she had not reached a clean conclusion. She nodded once and picked up her patient board and started her rounds. She got to Kell's room at 7:40 after she'd checked in on the 4 other patients on her assignment and made sure there was nothing immediate requiring her attention. 2 military security officers stood outside his door, not the same 2. From the night before, fresh rotation, both of them with the particular posture of people who had been told to be visible. One of them moved to block her when she approached. "Nurse Voss," she said before he could ask. "He requested me." The officer looked at her badge, looked at her face, looked at a list on a tablet he was carrying, and then stepped aside. The room was dim. Kell had the blinds at half angle, filtering the early evening light into pale horizontal bars across the floor. He was sitting up, not fully, propped against the raised headboard at an angle that distributed his weight carefully away from the chest wound, and he was awake in the specific way she was learning to recognize as his default state, which was to say he was completely, unnervingly awake, the kind of awake that didn't have a resting mode. You actually came back, he said. I work here, she said, and pulled the chair to the side of the bed the way she had the night before, because she wasn't going to stand over him and she wasn't going to sit so far away that they'd have to project. Drawl came in this morning, Kell said. Gave me a treatment update. Didn't mention you. That sounds about right. He was quiet for a moment, assessing her in the same methodical way he'd assessed the room when he first opened his eyes. It was not a comfortable experience, being looked at like that. She didn't move away from it. What you did last night, he said. The protocol recognition. The hand thing. Yes. That's not standard nursing school. No. And you're not going to tell me more than you've already told me. I've told you what I'm cleared to tell you in this setting, which is essentially the shape of things without the specifics. I was Army. I was attached to a program that doesn't have a public name. I learned things that aren't in any civilian curriculum. And then I left and got a different degree and ended up here. She paused. That's the whole story. He looked at her for another moment, then shifted his gaze to the window. The horizontal bars of light had moved slightly as the angle of the sun changed. You said you don't have information about my team, he said. That's still true. I know. Something in his jaw moved. I wasn't asking you to fix that. He stopped. Started again from a slightly different place. There were 5 of them. My team. We'd been working together for 4 years. She didn't say anything. Some moments didn't benefit from a response. We into the sector on a standard reconnaissance task, he continued, in the flat, report quality voice he seemed to use when he was keeping his distance from the content. 6-man element, pre-planned routes, cleared comms. Everything checked. We'd done the same type of movement in the same general area 4 times in the preceding 8 months. He paused. The moment we crossed the second waypoint, they were already positioned. Both flanks. Elevated firing positions. They'd been there a while. The ones we could see when the shooting started had settled into their positions. They weren't responding to our movement. They were waiting for it. You reported this to the debriefing officers? There weren't any debriefing officers last night. There were hospital administrators and a man from Drawl's office asking if I needed more pain management. The flatness in his voice had acquired a thin edge. The actual debrief is scheduled for this morning. 2 military intelligence officers, conference room, 2 floors down, 900. Did you go? He looked at her again. No. She waited. I sent word that I wasn't medically cleared for transport to a conference room, he said. Which is true, technically. Oren signed off on restricted mobility. But that's not why. No. He let the word sit there for a moment. I know one of the 2 officers they're sending. Colonel Addison Ray. He was the logistics liaison who changed our communications frequency 48 hours before deployment. The air in the room changed quality. She sat with that for 3 full seconds, making sure she'd heard it correctly and understood the weight of what she was hearing. He changed your comms frequency, she said, keeping her voice even. Called it a security precaution. Routine protocol update. Made sense on paper. Our previous frequency had been in rotation long enough that a refresh wasn't unusual. Kell's voice was still flat, still reportorial, but she could see what it was costing him to maintain that. The muscle in his jaw, the particular stillness of his hands. The new frequency was what we used to transmit our updated coordinates when we crossed the first waypoint. Standard check-in. And 20 minutes later, both flanks opened up. You're saying someone fed your position to the ambush. I'm saying the math is clean. I'm saying I want that debrief taken by someone who isn't connected to the operation. He looked at her with the direct, unflinching attention of a man who had made a decision and was presenting it without dressing it up. I want you to take the statement. She had not seen that coming, and she was good enough at managing her reactions to keep that off her face, but only barely. I'm a nurse, she said. You were Army. You were attached to a classified program. You know how to handle sensitive information, the fact that you haven't said the name of the program, or the base, or the dates, or the exercise classifications, even here, even to establish credibility, tells me that. You're not going to run your mouth, and you're not going to give what I tell you to the wrong people. He paused. And you don't have any existing relationship with any of the officers who might be involved. Kell. She used his name carefully. What you're describing is serious enough that my taking your statement instead of a qualified intelligence officer is— I know what it is, he said. I need someone I can trust. Right now, you're the only one in this building who qualifies. The silence between them had texture to it. She was aware of the security officers outside the door, the distant sounds of the ward, the particular weight of what was being asked of her, not just to listen, but to become part of something that went significantly further than Bay 7, and a heart monitor and her, and a patient whose instincts she'd known how to read. She had signed papers once, she had made decisions once, that she had spent years afterward quietly closing the door on. She had built a life that fit within the boundaries of a nursing badge and a night shift and the specific, manageable satisfaction of work she was good at. Let me think about it, she said. He nodded once, which was not agreement so much as acknowledgement, that she was a person capable of making her own decisions, and he was not going to pressure her past the ask. That restraint told her something about him. She filed away without commenting on. She finished the medication check, noted the vitals, and left. She thought about it for 4 hours, which was not really thinking so much as it was arguing with herself while performing the mechanical routines of her shift. She thought about the papers she had signed and how much they actually bound her, and whether what he was describing superseded them. She thought about Addison Rae, who she didn't know, and whether the name would appear anywhere she could verify it. She thought about 5 men whose names she didn't have, who had crossed a waypoint and run into a prepared ambush, and whether the fact that psychologically, professionally, and whether the fact that she could help do something about that carried more weight than every cautious instinct she'd developed over 11 months of keeping her head down at Harwick. At 11:30 p.m., she went back to his room with a notebook she'd bought from the vending kiosk on the ground floor. A slim thing with a blue cover, the only option available. And she told the security officer outside the door that she needed to do a late vitals check, which was true. And she went in and sat down in the chair by the bed and set the notebook on her knee and said, "I'll take it. But I need you to understand that what I do with it, who I take it to, I'm going to make those decisions based on my own judgment." He said, "That's exactly what I want." So she wrote. He talked for 2 hours and 11 minutes. He was precise, in the way that people trained for precision were precise dates, coordinates described in general terms that conveyed geography without compromising classified specifics, timing, personnel roles, the sequence of events from the mission briefing through the communications frequency, change through the movement into sector, through the ambush itself, which he described without editorializing and without emotion. In the same flat report voice, though by the end of it she could see in the set of his shoulders and the controlled stillness of his hands what it cost him to keep the voice flat. She asked questions when she needed clarification. She didn't ask questions designed to push him toward conclusions she'd already formed. By the end of it, she had 11 pages of close handwriting and a clear, documented picture of a 6-man special operations team sent into a sector with a compromised communications frequency by a logistics officer who was now scheduled to attend the official debrief. She looked at what she had written, and then she looked at Kell, and she said, "You know what this means if it's accurate." "Yes," he said. "Someone inside the network sold your position. The technical term is deliberate compromise," he said, "but yes." She closed the notebook, held it with both hands on her knee, feeling the weight of what was inside it, which was not the weight of paper. Who do I take this to? Not Ray's chain, not anyone who had access to the deployment orders. He reached toward the small table beside the bed and picked up a folded piece of paper, the effort of reaching, cost Tim something visible, a tightness around his eyes that he didn't comment on, and held it out to her. That's a contact at JSOC's Independent Investigative Division. They operate outside the standard intelligence hierarchy, specifically for situations where the standard hierarchy may be compromised. They're not connected to Ray or the logistics network. She took the paper, unfolded it. Read the name and the contact protocol, not a phone number, something more structured than that. A layered communication method she recognized as the kind of channel that didn't leave a trace in the obvious places. "You had this prepared," she said. "I've been awake since 4 this morning." She refolded the paper and put it in her scrub pocket. "What happens when Ray finds out you didn't give him the debrief?" "He already knows. He'll have been told within an hour of me declining the conference room." Kell's voice was steady. "He'll request a bedside debrief next. Administration will agree because he has the rank for it. I'd expect him here within the next 24 hours. And when he shows up, I need you to be in this room when he does." He said it matter-of-factly, without apology for what he was asking. Not as a medical presence, as a witness. Someone outside his command structure who can document what he says and how he says it. The thing she felt was not fear, exactly. Fear had a specific texture she'd learned to recognize from experience. And this was adjacent to it, but different, more like the sensation of standing at the edge of something large and understanding. With your full body, that the ground behind you was not as stable as you'd assumed. "Kell," she said, "I'm a night shift nurse. You're a former Army combat medic with a classified service history who talked me back from a SERE lockdown using a protocol most active duty personnel don't recognize," he said. "You're not a night shift nurse. You're a night shift nurse right now." She picked up the notebook and stood. "I'll contact the JSOC line tonight," she said. "After my shift." He nodded. She was at the door when he said "Foss." She turned. "The man who changed our comms frequency." Something had shifted slightly in his expression, not much, but enough to read if you'd been watching his face long enough to know what neutral looked like on it. He did it in writing. Signed memo, routing through the logistics operations office. "You kept a copy," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I was a Tier 1 operator for 11 years, he said. "I kept copies of everything," she left. The contact method on the folded piece of paper required her to access a secure communications relay through a channel she hadn't used since 2012, which meant she spent 40 minutes of her break trying to remember the access per Mensur-Mean Tacit architecture before she admitted to herself that she didn't, and spent another 20 minutes working backward from what she did remember, until she found something close enough to function. The message she sent was brief, requesting contact. Sensitive material, potential deliberate compromise, active debrief interference. Source is principal witness, urgent. She hit send and then sat in the staff break room, staring at the water stain on the ceiling and wondering if she'd just done something irreversible. She had. The question was whether irreversible was the same as wrong. At 2:10 a.m., she was doing a round on the 3rd floor when her pager, a hospital system pager, the kind used only for internal alerts, buzzed with a code she didn't immediately recognize. She looked at it twice. Then she recognized it. Code Kessler. It was not an official Harwick medical code. There was no official Harwick medical code with that name. But it was a code she knew from a context she did not discuss, and it meant one specific thing. The situation has changed, and you need to move. She took the stairs. She came through the door onto Kell's floor at 2:13, and she could see from 20 feet away that something had happened. Both security officers who had been outside his room were gone. The door was ajar. The hallway had the specific quality of a space where controlled events had recently occurred, not visibly disturbed, but altered. The way a room feels different after furniture has been moved, even if you can't identify what changed. She went through the door. Kell was in the bed. He was not unconscious. He was sitting at the same angle she'd left him, but his hands were different, not flat on the blanket, but gripping the rail on one side with the white-knuckle controlled stillness of a man who had been visited and was processing the visit. "What happened?" she said. Ray didn't wait, Kell said. His voice had changed. Still flat, but with something underneath it now that wasn't there before. Not panic. Nothing like panic, but a kind of acute attention that preceded action. He came at 2:00 a.m. with two men I didn't recognize. The security detail was rotated out 15 minutes before he arrived. She let that sit for exactly the second it took to understand what it meant. Someone cleared the floor. Someone with enough authority to quietly rotate the detail without it looking like anything. He looked at her directly. He asked for the debrief. I told him I'd already given it. He asked to whom. I told him I wasn't sure of the name. What did he say? He said that any statement given to an unauthorized party had no legal standing and would be considered a breach of protocol. Kell's grip on the bed rail tightened slightly. Then he asked if I had retained any documentation from the operation, physical or digital. What did you tell him? I told him my personal equipment was destroyed in its extraction. He paused. Which is what I would tell someone I didn't trust. She understood. But it's not true. The copies I mentioned are not in this room, he said, but they exist. A beat. Ray left. He was professional about it. Polite, even. He said he'd reschedule for a more appropriate time. She looked at the empty doorway where the security officers should have been and were not. He's going to come back, she said. Yes, and next time he won't be alone in the unofficial sense. Kell released the bed rail. His hands went flat on the blanket again, deliberate, the gesture of a man choosing to control his posture. Notebook, he said. Off the premises, she said. I took it out during my break. Something changed in his face. Not dramatically, Kell didn't do dramatic, but the particular tension around his eyes released by a degree she could measure. Good. The JSOC contact, she said. I sent the message. I know. He reached to the table beside the bed again, picked up his phone, not the hospital-issue handset, a personal phone that should not technically have been in the room, and turned the screen toward her. There was a single line of text on it, a confirmation code. The same relay channel she'd used. Received. Stand by for contact. Secure your material. She looked at the message and then at him. They're already in it, he said. Whatever Ray thinks he's managing, he's already 12 hours behind. She should have felt relieved. She knew that. She understood intellectually that this was the moment where the situation shifted from dangerously isolated to something with infrastructure behind it, something with reach. What she actually felt was the particular cold clarity of a person standing in a room where two different forces had just become aware of each other, and understanding with her whole body that she was the point where they connected. She pulled the chair to the bed again and sat down because her legs were doing something she didn't want to acknowledge. Tell me about the documentation, she said. The copies you kept? He told her. She listened, and the more she listened, the more the picture assembled itself in her mind with the specific, unwelcome clarity of something that had been true for a long time before anyone bothered to look at it. The signed memo changing the communications frequency. The routing records showing which office had processed it and at what time. The GPS logs from the team's equipment showing their final position with the firing positions they'd identified during the ambush. And one more thing, a payment record, partial, fragmentary, something Kell had stumbled onto by accident 6 weeks before the deployment, six weeks before, while doing a routine equipment audit, which he had photographed and stored and flagged internally to a superior he trusted, and which had subsequently disappeared from the reporting chain without acknowledgement. He had kept the photograph. By the time he finished, it was 3:00 a.m., and Marlo Voss was sitting in a dim hospital room, holding a blue notebook she'd bought from a vending machine. And everything she'd spent 11 months carefully not being was sitting on top of her like a second skin she hadn't asked for and couldn't take off. Ray has a code name, Kell said. She looked at him. Among the people who know what he is, he said. The code name is Blackstone. The silence in the room was absolute. Then, from somewhere in the hospital, she couldn't identify the floor, couldn't identify the room, an alarm began to sound. Not a patient alarm, a security alarm. And, on Kel's personal phone, sitting on the table between them, a new message appeared on the screen in the relay channel she'd used to contact JSOC. She leaned forward and read it. 4 words. The survivor must be eliminated. She read it twice, because 4 words required reading twice, when they meant what those 4 words meant. Then she looked up at Kel and said, "We need to move." He was already pushing the blanket off his legs. "You can't," she said. "Your chest wound, I'm aware of my chest wound." He swung his legs over the side of the bed, with the controlled, careful motion of someone managing pain through technique rather than ignoring it. "What I can't do is stay in a room with no security detail and a compromised floor access point while someone with enough pull to rotate my protection out at 2 in the morning figures out where his next move is." She stood up. The alarm that had started somewhere below them was still going, not escalating, not the rising pitch of a crisis code, but steady, which meant security response rather than medical, which meant someone had tripped a perimeter sensor or a door contact somewhere in the building, or someone had triggered it deliberately. "The documentation," she said. "You said copies exist. Where? Not in this building." He was standing now, one hand on the bed rail, testing his weight distribution with the unconscious assessment of someone who had done physical damage inventories on themselves before. His face showed the cost of standing, but his posture absorbed it. "I need 12 minutes and a floor that isn't this one." She picked up the blue notebook from the chair and looked at it for half a second, then crossed to the small closet beside the window and pulled it open. His personal clothing was inside, bagged and tagged from the medevac intake. She pulled the bag down and set it on the bed. "You're not medically cleared for Voss." He looked at her, not impatiently, but with the directness of a man who needed her on the same page immediately. "I know what I'm cleared for. I know what my body is doing. I've operated in worse condition than this. I need you to decide right now whether you're in this with me or whether you're going to stand in the doorway and recite protocol while someone Ray sent figures out which room I'm in." She set the notebook on top of the clothing bag. "I'm in it," she said. "But if you tear that chest repair, I'm going to be furious with you." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. He started working through the clothing bag. She went to the door and looked out into the hallway. The floor was not empty. There was a nurse she recognized. There was an Spalik from the day rotation at the far end, pushing a medication cart, moving in the opposite direction. Overhead, the security alarm continued its steady tone. The 2 posts outside Kel's door were still empty. She looked at the elevator bank and then at the stairwell door and made a calculation. "Stairwell," she said, coming back into the room. "Not the elevator. If someone's monitoring floor access, the elevator log is the first place they look." He had his clothes on not quickly. She could see it had taken effort, his jaw set in a particular way that told her. The chest wound had objected to the arm movements, and he was holding the phone in one hand and had tucked something small and flat into his waistband that she didn't ask about. They moved. The stairwell was 2 doors down, accessed through a fire door that she pushed open carefully and held while he came through. He was moving well better than she'd expected, though she'd reset her expectations downward from normal human baselines after watching what his nervous system was capable of. He was favoring his left side slightly, redistributing the chest wall pressure, and his breathing had a controlled deliberateness that told her he was managing rather than comfortable, but he was upright and he was moving. "Where are we going?" she asked, keeping her voice low, the stairwell amplifying sound in ways that discouraged anything above a murmur. "Second floor has a records annex," he said. "Staff access. No patient traffic after midnight. I need to make contact through a secondary channel, and I need a room that isn't on the patient floor grid." "How do you know about the records annex?" "I've been awake since 4 yesterday morning." he said. I asked one of the overnight orderlies about the building layout. People tell you things when you're the patient. They took the stairs down 2 floors, Kell managing the descent with his hand on the rail, and a pace that was slower than either of them, wanted but faster than was strictly sensible. And she stayed close enough on his left side to provide a contact point if his balance shifted without making it obvious that she was doing so. The records annex was unlocked, a long, narrow room with 2 banks of filing cabinets and a single workstation with an aging desktop computer and the specific institutional smell of paper and recycled air. She hit the lights, decided against it, and instead navigated by the ambient glow from the security strip at floor level, pulling the door shut behind them. Kell went to the workstation, pulled the rolling chair out, sat down with a careful exhalation that told her more about his pain level than he probably intended, and brought out the phone. He navigated to something she couldn't see from her angle and began composing a message. She positioned herself beside the door with a view through the narrow glass panel set into it, watching the hallway outside. The JSOC contact, she said, the one who sent the 4 words. Was that channel secure from your end? My end, yes. Yours is what I'm not certain about. He kept his eyes on the phone. The relay I gave you is clean by design, but if your device was already flagged before you used it, the message content might be less protected than the channel itself. My phone isn't flagged, as far as you know. She thought about that and didn't enjoy the thinking. The forward message, she said. That came through the same relay you gave me for the JSOC contact. Yes, which means either JSOC sent it or someone who had access to that channel sent it. He looked up from the phone briefly. I've been sitting with that since you read it. The channel is supposedly compartmented. But a compartmented channel that Ray's network has somehow accessed is a different problem than a direct threat from JSOC, and I need to know which one I'm dealing with before I decide how much to trust the contact who's supposed to be on our side. The hallway outside the door was empty. She kept watching it. The security alarm that had been running since 2:07 stopped at 2:24. The sudden silence was worse. It stopped, she said. I heard. That means either they found what triggered it or they shut it off manually. He set the phone face down on the desk and turned in the chair to look at her. What's your read on Bate? The shift in subject caught her slightly off guard. Bate, the specialist, the one who gave you the 2 minutes. She thought about Bate's face when he'd looked at the transcribed tap sequence. The quality of the attention he'd given it. The single question, where did you learn to read this? Not what is this, or is this real? He'd known what it was. He'd been deciding how much she knew. He has a background, she said. More than he's shown. That's my read, too. Kell picked the phone back up. I want him in the room when I talk to the JSOC team directly. Not draw Bate. I can get Bate. Not right now. He was typing again. Right now, I need you to tell me who on your staff has access to the after-hours security rotation schedule. The one that determines which personnel are posted on which floor, she thought. Security office handles the physical rotation, but the schedule is generated through hospital administration. The overnight duty manager has access. Department heads can request adjustments with 12 hours notice, and she stopped. And any military personnel with patient protective status can request rotation adjustments through a liaison office that bypasses the standard chain. The liaison reports to the medical director, not to hospital security. Ray has patient protective status on this floor from the moment I was admitted, Kell said, which means he had the mechanism to rotate the detail without going through security at all. He could have done it from the conference room with a phone call. She had known that somewhere under the surface of her thinking, but hearing it stated plainly, with its full implication assembled, was different. Ray had not needed to improvise. He had used an existing administrative structure to clear the floor, and it had worked cleanly and left no obvious trace, because on paper it would look like a routine rotation. He planned it before he came to your room tonight, she said. He planned it before he knew whether I'd talk to him or not. Kel's voice had not changed in pitch or pace, but it had acquired a particular quality she recognized from the 2 hours she'd spent taking his statement, the quality of a person who was angry, and had decided the anger would be more useful as precision than as heat. Whatever he came to the room for, it wasn't the debrief. The debrief was cover. He wanted to see what condition I was in and whether I'd made contact with anyone. The door at the far end of the corridor, the one that connected to the main ward hallway, opened. She put her hand flat on the glass panel of the records room door and went very still. 2 men came through, not in medical scrubs, not in military uniform. Civilian clothing, the nondescript variety that announced itself by how carefully it avoided announcement. One of them was holding something she couldn't identify from the angle and the distance. They moved with the specific, unhurried directness of people who knew where they were going and had already decided how the interaction at the end of the walk would proceed. They went into the stairwell. Up. 2 men, she said quietly. Civilian clothes. Heading up through the stairwell. Toward my room. Yes. Kel was already standing, which was faster than she'd expected and less steady than she wanted. And he had the phone in one hand and whatever was tucked in his waistband in the other, and his face had gone to a specific neutral that she understood was not calm, but was the thing that lived in the same structural neighborhood as calm. We can't stay here, she said. No. And we can't go back up. No. The ground floor has a service corridor that connects to the loading dock on the east side, she said, pulling the layout from memory 11 months. She knew the building. The dock is external, but it's monitored by a camera that covers the west approach only. East side is a blind spot. He looked at her for 1 second, with an expression she had no category for, not surprise, not approval, something more specific than either. Lead, he said. They moved back into the stairwell, going down this time instead of up, and she set the pace because she needed to, and he let her set it without argument, which told her that he understood the dynamic had shifted, and he was operating in her environment now rather than his. His breathing was more audible on the stairs than it had been going up. The chest wound was making itself known. Ground floor. Service corridor. She knew the code for the secondary access panel from 11 months of navigating around laundry, carts, and supply deliveries, punched it in, and pulled the door open. The service corridor was narrow and lit by fluorescent strips that buzzed at a frequency she'd stopped hearing months ago. They moved through it quickly, past the laundry room, past the dietary supply storage, past the maintenance office that was always locked, and she could hear his breathing, and she was monitoring it without making it obvious that she was monitoring it. "How's the chest?" she asked. "Functional. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have." At the end of the corridor, the loading dock door. She looked through the wire-reinforced window set into it before she pushed it open, confirmed the angle of the camera, confirmed the blind spot she'd identified was where she remembered it being, and pushed. Cold air. The eastern side of the building, a concrete apron, a chain-link fence, 20 feet out, and beyond that a service road that connected to the hospital's secondary access route. Kel came through the door behind her, and the cold hit him, and she saw his chest expand on the inhale and hold for a beat too long. "Kel, I'm fine. Your color says differently." "My color has been wrong for 3 days. It's not new information." He moved to the fence line, scanning the service road. "There's a vehicle staged on the east approach. I put it there before I was transferred out of Bay 7. She stared at him. "When did you? You were unconscious when you came in." "I regained coherence approximately 6 hours before you officially stabilized me," he said, with the matter-of-fact quality of a man reporting a logistical detail. "I was not in a position to communicate, but I was able to receive. I heard enough of the conversation in Bay 7 to understand I was in a federal facility, and I sent a message through a secondary device I had on my person. The secondary device that also should not have been in the room. Correct. She looked at him for a moment. You were running operational contingencies while you were in psychological lockdown. Compartmentalization, he said, and the word had the quality of something he'd lived inside for so long it had stopped being a concept and become a physical fact about himself. Part of me was locked down. Part of me was still working. The vehicle was a gray sedan, unremarkable, parked on the service road against the fence. A man was leaning against the driver's side, and when Kell raised one hand in a specific gesture, the man straightened and came to the fence gate. She didn't recognize him. He was in his 40s, compact, with the particular quality of stillness she'd started associating with people who had spent significant time in operational environments. He looked at her, and then at Kell, and then, without asking any of the questions she expected, pulled out a key and opened the gate. "This is Voss," Kell said. "She's inside the wire." The man nodded once. Reyes, he said, which she understood was a name being offered at the same level of specificity she'd offered her own. They moved toward the vehicle. She was 3 steps from the fence gate when her hospital pager went off. She looked at the number. It was Theo's extension. She stopped walking and looked at the pager, and then back at Kell, who had turned around to look at her. "Someone on your staff?" he asked. "The nurse I work with." He wouldn't page me at this hour unless she stopped. Unless something had happened. Unless something on her floor required her. Unless someone had noticed she and Kell were both missing from the building. Or unless someone had gotten to Theo. Her hands had gone cold in a way that wasn't the outside air. "I have to answer it," she said. "If you call from your personal phone." "I know." She looked at him. "I'll use the service corridor landline." "There's one inside the loading dock door." She handed him, the blue notebook held it out, didn't explain. He took it without explanation, and she turned and went back inside. The landline was mounted to the wall beside the maintenance office. She picked it up and dialed Theo's extension. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been standing next to the phone. "Voss," he said, and the quality of his voice stopped her. Cold, too controlled, too careful. The voice of someone who was aware of being listened to. "There's a situation on 3. Dr. Bate is asking for you specifically. He says it's about the patient in 312. 312 was Kell's room." "What kind of situation?" she asked. He said Theo paused, and in the pause she heard something she couldn't identify, a quality of held breath, of someone composing a message under constraint. "He said to tell you that the chart notes from last night's intervention need to be reviewed. He said you'd understand what that meant." She understood what it meant. Bate was telling her something had been found, or altered, or both. "I'll come up," she said. "I'll come up." She hung up and stood in the service corridor for 5 seconds, and then she went back out through the loading dock door. Kell and Reyes were at the vehicle. She walked to the fence. "I have to go back in," she said. Kell looked at her. "What happened?" "Bate is on 3. He's signaling through a staff channel. I think the chart records from last night have been accessed. If Ray's people found the entry notes from my intervention, they know the timeline. They know what I documented and when. Which means they know you have more than a bedside log." "Yes." A beat of silence. "The notebook is safer with Reyes than with either of us right now," Kell said. He was looking at her with the specific attention that didn't ask more than the situation required. "Go. Find out what Bate has. If you can't reach the JSOC channel safely from inside, there's a secondary protocol on the back page of the notebook. Reyes knows it." She looked at Reyes, who nodded. She looked at Kell, standing at the fence line with his hand on the chain link because his chest needed the support, and he wasn't going to say so. "You need medical attention," she said. "I need 24 hours and the right people in a room together," he said. "Then I'll let you fix the chest." She turned and went back into the building. The service corridor, the fluorescent buzz, the laundry smell, the stairwell door. She took the stairs up to 3 and pushed through into the ward hallway and walked with the deliberate normalcy of a person who was exactly where she was supposed to be. Kell's room door was open. Dr. Bate was inside, standing next to the empty bed, holding a tablet. He looked up when she came through the door. His expression was not the expression of a man who had found an empty room and was confused by it. It was the expression of a man who had expected the room to be empty and was relieved that she had arrived before anyone else did. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "I pulled the digital chart access log at 2:05 this morning," he said, without preamble. Someone accessed Kell's admission records and the nursing intervention notes from last night at 1:52 a.m. using a credential set that belongs to Dr. Drawl. Drawl accessed them? Drawl was at home. I called him 20 minutes ago. Bate set the tablet down on the empty bed, screen up, showing a column of access timestamps. Someone used his credential token, which means either his access card was cloned, or someone in this building has the ability to generate false credentials against our system. She looked at the timestamps and then at Bate. What was accessed? The admission form, the intake paramedic notes, specifically the paradoxical sedation notation. Your intervention documentation from the overnight. And he stopped. And in the stop, she heard something she hadn't heard from him before, which was a person running up against the edge of their own certainty. And a note I added to the file at 3:30 this morning. What note? A clinical observation regarding the mechanism of Kell's recovery, he said, in which I documented that the stabilization was achieved through what appeared to be specialized knowledge of classified military conditioning protocols administered by the night shift nurse on duty, and that the intervention was inconsistent with standard civilian nursing in training. She stood very still. "You flagged me," she said. "I documented what I observed," he said. "Which is what I'm required to do." He looked at her directly, and now she could see what lived behind the evaluative quality she'd been reading in him since the first night. Not just assessment. Something more active than that. Something that had been making decisions alongside the assessments the whole time. I also made a second documentation entry in a separate system at 340. One that doesn't go through the hospital network. What system? He picked up the tablet and turned it toward her. The screen showed a document header she recognized, because she had seen its format once before in a briefing room in 2010, attached to a program that didn't have a public name. He had flagged this through a JSOC adjacent reporting channel. She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not just a specialist," she said. "I'm a specialist," he said. "I'm also something else, when the situation requires it." He picked up the tablet again. The forward message that came through the relay channel at 2:17 this morning, I sent it. The floor shifted under her in a way that wasn't physical. "You sent it," she said, "as a warning, not a threat." His voice was steady, clinical, the voice of a man explaining a decision he'd made and would make again. "I needed to know if Kell had already established a secure channel and whether you were inside it with him." The message was a verification probe. If you'd been compromised, the response pattern would have been different. You went dark and moved instead. That's the right answer. He paused. "Where is he?" She looked at Marcus Bates, standing in the empty room where Darian Kell had been, with his specialist's credentials and his JSOC adjacent reporting channel and his verification probe sent at 2:17 in the morning, and she made the fastest and most consequential assessment of a person she had ever made. She had been wrong about people before. She had also been right. "He's secure," she said. "The two men who went up the stairwell at 2:22 are still in the building," Bates said. "I have them on camera in the east stairwell, floor 4, as of 6 minutes ago. They're looking for him. When they don't find him in the room, they'll start looking at the exits." He looked at her. "And Ray is not done. What he did tonight with the rotation was a test of what he could move without resistance. The next step won't be two men in a stairwell. The window of the empty room was dark. The cities outside reduced to points of light in the pre-dawn black, and Marlowe Voss stood between a bed that contained no one and a man she had decided to trust based on 30 seconds of evaluation and the particular quality of how he'd looked at a piece of paper 2 days ago. "Tell me what the next step looks like," she said. Bate opened his mouth to answer. The door to the room opened. Colonel Addison Rae walked in, with 2 uniformed officers behind him, and looked at the empty bed, and then at Marlowe, and then at Bate, and his face was the face of a man who had arrived, expecting one situation, and found another, and was recalculating. "Dr. Bate," he said, "Nurse Voss." His voice was entirely, precisely pleasant. "I'm going to need to know where the patient is." Nobody answered him immediately, which was itself a kind of answer. Marlowe watched Ray's eyes move through the room the way a person's eyes move when they're doing inventory. The empty bed, the raised headboard, still angled from where Kell had been sitting, Atticad, the IV line disconnected and hanging, the folded hospital blanket at the foot of the mattress. He was a man who read rooms professionally, and this one was telling him something he didn't want to know. He looked at Bate first, because Bate had rank equivalency and the habit of command, and then he looked at Marlowe, because she was the variable he hadn't fully accounted for. "I'll ask again," he said, with the precise pleasantness of someone who had not yet decided to stop being pleasant. "Where is Staff Sergeant Kell?" "I'm not certain," Bate said. "You're not certain?" Ray repeated it without inflection. "You're the senior specialist on his case, and you're standing in his empty room at 3 in the morning, and you're not certain where he is. He's ambulatory. He's a patient with restricted mobility, not a prisoner. If he chose to move through the facility, he's a patient with 2 gunshot wounds who was in critical condition 18 hours ago." Ray's pleasantness had acquired a very thin edge, like a piece of paper held at the right angle to cut. "His leaving this floor without medical clearance is a safety issue, which means it falls under my protective jurisdiction, which means I need to know where he is." He looked at Marlowe. "Nurse Voss, you were assigned to this floor tonight." "I was," she said. "Did you see Sergeant Kell leave his room?" She looked at Ray and understood, with the complete and specific clarity of a person who has run out of the kind of room that benefits from careful management, that this was the moment where a certain kind of careful stopped being useful. Ray had walked in here with 2 uniformed officers and a jurisdiction claim and the organizational authority that came from a career spent moving through the right channels. He was not going to be navigated around. He was going to be met. "I did," she said. Ray's expression shifted by a degree she might have missed if she hadn't been watching for it. "And you didn't report it." "I didn't have the opportunity." "You arrived. Where did he go?" "He didn't tell me." It was true. He hadn't told her. He'd told her the vehicle was staged on the east approach, and she'd seen it with her own eyes, and Reyes had driven away with the blue notebook while she was walking back through the loading dock, but Kell had not told her where Reyes was taking it or where the vehicle was going, and she had not asked because she'd understood that the less she could tell, the less anyone could get from her. Ray looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the 2 officers behind him and said, "Pull the exit camera footage from the last 90 minutes. All external doors." One of them stepped out. The remaining officer positioned himself near the door in a way that was not quite blocking it, but made the intention clear. "Dr. Bate," Ray said, turning back to the room, "I'd like to understand why you're here." "I received an alert on the patient monitoring system," Bate said. "Kell's vitals stopped transmitting at approximately 2:19. I came to check. At 3 in the morning. I'm on call." Ray looked between them, and what lived in his face during that look was not anger, not yet, but calculation. The specific, active intelligence of a man who was very good at his work, running up against a situation where the pieces were arranged in a way that required more information before he could move effectively. He was not stupid. She had known from the beginning he was not stupid, and standing across from him now confirmed it in a way that was not reassuring. "Nurse Voss," he said, I'm going to need you to come with me. To where? Administration has a room available for interviews. Standard protocol when a patient leaves a monitored floor without clearance. I'm in the middle of my shift. Your charge nurse has been notified. Coverage is arranged. He said it with the ease of someone who had made those arrangements before he walked through the door, which meant he'd planned for this version of events, alongside every other version, and the planning told her something about how long he'd been thinking about her, specifically. She looked at Bate. Bate's face gave her nothing she could read as instruction, which was itself an instruction. He wasn't going to intervene here, because intervening here would tell Ray more than letting it proceed. She went. The interview room was on the administrative floor, a level below the main wards. A space that managed to feel simultaneously institutional and deliberately unremarkable, the kind of room designed to communicate that whatever happened in it was routine. A table, 4 chairs, a wall-mounted camera in the upper right corner with a small red indicator light that told her it was recording. Ray sat across from her, and the remaining officer sat to the side, and nobody offered her water. Ray asked her questions for 40 minutes. He was precise and methodical and genuinely skilled at the work, which she respected in the abstract and found deeply inconvenient in practice. He moved through the timeline of Kel's admission, her intervention in Bay 7, her access to his room. Over the subsequent days, the notes she'd made in the official chart, and the question of whether she had received any communication from Kel that constituted a transfer of information outside authorized medical channels. She answered everything accurately and completely within the boundaries of what she could legally be compelled to disclose, which was less than he wanted and more than she was comfortable with. And she felt the seam between those two categories, like a physical thing, throughout the entire 40 minutes. She did not mention the notebook. She did not mention Reyes. She did not mention the secondary communication channel or the JSOC contact or the 11 pages of documentation she had spent 2 hours compiling in a dim room, while Kel's voice ran flat and precise through the worst night of his career. When Ray asked if she had taken any physical documents from Kel's room or from any related area of the hospital, she said no, which was true in the present tense, and she did not volunteer the past tense. At 4:05 a.m., Ray's phone buzzed on the table between them. He looked at it, and something changed in his face, not dramatically, not the kind of change that announced itself, but the specific micro-adjustment of a person receiving information that alters their position in a situation they thought they controlled. He stood up. "We'll continue this conversation later today," he said. "Please don't leave the facility without notifying administration." He left. The officer left. She sat in the interview room alone for approximately 30 seconds and then stood up and walked out because nobody had told her she couldn't. She found Bate in the second-floor corridor, outside the records annex, which was either coincidence or communication, and she chose to interpret it as communication and stopped walking when she reached him. "His phone went off," she said quietly. "I know what went off," Bate said. He was looking straight ahead, not at her, the posture of two people having a conversation that should not look like a conversation. The JSOC investigative team made contact with Harwick's commanding medical officer at 3:47 a.m. Official inquiry, not a request. They cited a potential compromise of patient security and integrity of a military debrief process. He paused. They also cited a specific reporting entry filed through a protected channel at 340 hours. His entry, the one he'd made in the system she'd recognized from 2010. "That's what was on his phone," she said. "That's what was on his phone." She exhaled slowly. "He's going to know it came from inside the building. He already knows it came from inside the building. He doesn't know from whom, yet." Bate turned his head slightly, not enough to look directly at her, just enough to shift the angle. Kel reached the secondary contact point at 3:30. "He's secure," The documentation is in transit to the investigative team through a channel Ray doesn't have visibility into. She felt something release in her chest that had been contracted for hours, and she did not mistake that release for safety, because safety was not what the situation contained yet. But it was something. It was the infrastructure she'd been operating without since 2:17 a.m. finally being present. What happens now, she asked. Now it's a race, Bates said simply. The race had a shape she couldn't fully see yet, but she could trace its edges over the next several hours through the texture of the hospital's behavior, the way certain conversations stopped when she walked near them, the way Drawl came to find her at 7:15 a.m., with an expression she'd never seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who has learned something that required him to revise not just a clinical decision, but a broader judgment. There are investigators in the building, Drawl said. He said it without preamble, which was not his habit, which told her the departure from habit was meaningful. I'm aware, she said. He looked at her for a long moment with the specific quality of a man reassembling a picture he'd previously understood as complete. The chart access from last night, he said. My credentials. Were used without your knowledge, she said. Bate confirmed it. Another long look. I owe you an apology, he said, and the words came out with the effortful precision of a person who had practiced a version of them and was now producing a slightly worse version under pressure. From the first night, my assessment of the situation was significantly incomplete. Yes, she said. She did not soften it. She didn't have the energy for softening, and she thought he didn't need the softening as much as he did the directness. It was. He nodded once tight and walked away. At 9:00 a.m., a 4-person team from JSOC's Independent Investigative Division arrived at Harwick Military Medical Center in 2 unmarked vehicles and requested access to the medical director's office, which was granted because the request came with documentation that did not leave room for alternative responses. Marlowe was not in the meeting. She was finishing her shift, charting the overnight, doing the mechanical, ordinary work of her job, while the building around her underwent a change in atmospheric pressure that everyone could feel, and no one on the floor below was discussing openly. At 10:22 a.m., Colonel Addison Ray was escorted from the administrative floor to a secure vehicle in the hospital's main lot by 2 investigators and 1 uniformed military police officer. The escort was not announced. It did not use the main lobby. It used the staff exit on the north side, the one that put out onto the delivery road rather than the main entrance, and the 3 people who saw it happen were an orderly, who was taking a break, and a facilities technician, and Marlowe Voss, who was walking to her car at the end of her shift and stopped at the corner of the building and watched it happen from 40 feet away. Ray walked with his hands free and his posture composed, which was either dignity or performance, or both, and she watched him fold himself into the back of the vehicle with the specific controlled movement of a man who had made a calculation about how this moment would be recorded and was managing his exit accordingly. The door closed. The vehicle moved. She stood in the cold for another moment after it was gone, her breath visible in the morning air, her hands in her jacket pockets, her feet on the asphalt of a parking lot that looked exactly the same as it had the day before, and felt entirely different. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize, 11 digits, with an area code she couldn't place. The message was 4 words, which was a coincidence she would think about later. This time the 4 words were, room 312. 30 minutes. She stood in the parking lot and looked at the message, and then put her phone in her pocket and got in her car and sat there for a moment with her hands on the wheel and the engine not started. 30 minutes. She started the engine. Room 312 was Kel's room, which no longer contained the empty bed with the folded blanket at the foot. Someone had remade it new sheets, headboard back to its default angle and sitting in it, upright, attached to a monitoring line and an IV and visibly in pain in a way that he was managing with the same compressed technique she'd cataloged over the past 3 days. was Darian Kell. He looked like he'd slept approximately 2 hours, which was more than her. Reyes was not in the room. Bate was, standing near the window, and with him was a woman. Marlowe had not seen before late 40s, civilian clothing that fit well, with the kind of face that had learned a long time ago to show nothing it didn't intend to show. She had a tablet under one arm and the general bearing of someone who had been in motion since before the sun came up. "Agent Lena Ferris," the woman said, when Marlowe came through the door. "JSOC Independent Investigative Division. Your Voss." "Yes. Sit down if you want. This won't be comfortable either way." Marlowe sat. Old habit, take the seat, establish the position, save the energy that would otherwise go into standing. Ferris set the tablet on the bedside table and turned it so the screen faced the room. On it was a document Marlowe recognized as a structural match to the intake forms she'd seen during her attachment in 2010. The kind of form that didn't have a department header or a case number visible on the first page because the case number was on a separate access-controlled index. "We received the documentation package from Sergeant Kell's secure relay at 4:15 this morning," Ferris said. "The signed memo authorizing the communications frequency change, the logistics routing records, the GPS cross-reference, and a partial payment record that we've spent the last 6 hours running against 3 financial databases." She paused. "The payment record connects to a procurement account associated with a foreign-facing defense contractor. The contractor has a registered address in 2 countries and does no identifiable legitimate business in either. It's a channel, a payment channel," Marlowe said, "for moving money to people who move information." "Yes." Ferris's voice was entirely matter-of-fact. The register of a person for whom this type of information had stopped being shocking some years ago and had become simply the material of the work. Ray's connection to the account is indirect, 1 remove, possibly 2, but the timing of the transfers correlates to 3 separate deployments over the past 22 months, including the cycle that put Kell's team in sector. 3 deployments. Not 1, not an isolated decision made under pressure. A pattern. She looked at Kell, who was looking at the tablet, and his face was doing the thing it did when the content required more management than the surface showed. "His team," she said to Ferris. "The 5 men." Ferris looked at her, then at Kell. "2 confirmed dead," Kell said. His voice was level. "2 missing, presumed captured. 1. He stopped for exactly the length of time it took to move something from one category to another in his own accounting. 1 unaccounted for. The extraction team found evidence he was alive at the secondary waypoint. That's all we have." The room held that for a moment. "The investigation is now active at the federal level," Ferris said, moving forward with the professional necessity of someone who could not afford to stop. "Ray is in custody pending formal charges. The 2 logistics officers who processed the frequency change memo are being located. The contractor account has been flagged for financial intelligence review." She looked at Marlowe directly. "The statement you took from Sergeant Kell, the 11-page document, we need it entered into the evidentiary record under your name as the collecting party." "I'm a nurse," Marlowe said, and then heard herself say it. And what she heard was the way it had started to sound like a sentence she'd been given to repeat, rather than a sentence she'd chosen. "You're a former Army combat medic with a classified service history who documented a principal witness's statement in real time while the authorized interview process was being deliberately obstructed," Ferris said, without heat, without emphasis, as though she were simply correcting a factual error. "The statement is legally valid. The manner of collection is defensible. We need your signature on the evidentiary submission." She looked at Bate, who gave her nothing, which she had come to understand as his version of, "This is yours to decide." She looked at Kell. He was watching her with the same direct, no-pressure attention he'd offered when he first asked her to take the statement. Not asking her to be more than she was, not pretending what he was asking for was small. "Send me the submission form," she said to Ferris. Ferris pulled up the document on the tablet and turned it toward her. It took her 12 minutes to read it completely, because she was not going to sign something she hadn't read, and she found 3 places where the language required clarification. And she asked for the clarification, and Ferris provided it without irritation, which told her something about Ferris that she added to the pile of things she was still assembling about the people in this room. She signed. The next 4 hours proceeded with the specific grinding momentum of a formal investigation that had found its footing and was not going to be redirected. The hospital's administrative structure was essentially commandeered politely with the correct documentation. But commandeered, and the sequence of events was that she was formally interviewed by 2 investigators, that she was formally tested, that interview recorded and transcribed, and that the transcript was immediately incorporated into the growing case file that Ferris's team had been building since they arrived. She told them everything, all of it. The notebook content, the relay channel, the records annex, the loading dock. She told them about the TAP sequence and the SAR-IRE protocol and the 2 hours in Bay 7 and the conversation in which Kell had said they knew we were coming. She told them about Ray's midnight visit and the rotated security detail and the 2 men in civilian clothing she'd watched go up the stairwell at 2:22. She told them about Dr. Bate, and at that point, Ferris looked at Bate with the expression of 2 people who knew each other in a context not visible to the rest of the room. Bate filed the protected channel report, Ferris said, and it wasn't a question. He did, Marlowe said. Ferris made a notation. At 2:00 p.m., Marlowe had been awake for 32 hours, and her body was registering that fact in the specific, detailed way that bodies registered information when the adrenaline had finished its work and left the invoice. She was sitting in the corridor outside the medical director's office, because there was no more useful place to be at that particular moment. And Theo appeared from the direction of the elevators with 2 coffees from the ground floor vending machine and held one out without saying anything, which was the correct approach. She took it. "You look terrible," he said. "I've been awake since yesterday morning." "I know. I've also been awake since yesterday morning. Mine is because of you." He sat down in the adjacent chair and looked at that middle distance, in the way of someone who has had an experience they haven't yet found the right language for. "The investigators talked to me for 2 hours. I know. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. I told them about the pager message. The way I said it. They said it was helpful." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Is Kell going to be okay? Medically, yes. If he stops doing things before I clear him." She paused. "The other parts are complicated. The 2 men who went up the stairwell." He set it to his coffee cup. "Security found them on 4. They said they were visiting a patient. There was no patient record for either of them. Where are they now?" "Ferris's team took them about an hour ago." He looked at her sideways. "This is not what I thought working at a military hospital was going to be like." "No," she agreed. "It usually isn't." She finished the coffee and stood up because sitting was starting to tip toward sleep, and she needed to stay functional for another hour or 2 before she could safely stop. At 3:15 p.m., she went back to room 312. Kell was alone. Bate had gone. Ferris had gone. The room had the quieter quality of a space where the event density had dropped from crisis to aftermath. His monitor was showing numbers she approved of: heart rate stable, oxygen saturation at 94, the blood pressure still lower than she'd like, but trending. His color was still wrong, as he'd noted himself, but less wrong than it had been at the loading dock at 3 in the morning. She checked the chest wound dressing without being asked and found it intact. No cease, no sign that the movement he'd done earlier had torn anything, which was more luck than management. "You got away with it," she said, the chest. He looked at her hands as she reseated the tape at the edge of the dressing. "Next time you decide to walk out of a hospital in the middle of the night, tell me first so I can make sure you're not going to bleed into your thoracic cavity. I'll add it to the protocol." She stepped back, looked at him. He looked back at her with the same direct attention, that had stopped being uncomfortable some in the last 48 hours and had become simply the way he looked at things he was trying to understand accurately. Ferris's team, he said. They're moving fast. Yes. Ray's network is larger than one person and one logistics chain. He knew that. I knew that. Ferris knows it. The contractor account connects to at least 3 other operational channels. This isn't going to close in a week. I know. It's going to require testimony from multiple sources, extended cooperation with the investigation, access to the statement you collected, and potentially additional documentation sessions. He paused, and in the pause she could see the shape of what was building up to, which was a person who needed something from her that he was going to present without dressing it up. I asked Ferris to attach you formally to the investigative support structure as a civilian subject matter resource. She looked at him. A nurse, she said. A former Army combat medic with a classifieds and service history, he said, which was what Ferris had said, which she understood meant it was also what he had said to Ferris when he made the request. She walked to the window and looked out at Davenport's unremarkable skyline, the river that nobody fished in, the highway exit, and the strip mall pharmacies and the flat gray sky doing what flat gray Oregon skies did in the late afternoon and early spring. I'll think about it, she said. That's the same thing you said when I asked you to take the statement. And I did that, didn't I? He was quiet for a moment. Then Voss, she turned. The men on my team, he said. The 2 that are missing. His voice had the flat reportorial quality she recognized, the quality of managed distance, but underneath it, she could hear the current that the management was working to contain. If there's a network, if it's larger than Ray, then wherever they are, whoever has them is connected to the same structure. Getting to the bottom of Blackstone's operation isn't abstract for me. She understood that. She understood it completely. She understood it completely, and it was the most honest thing he'd said to her that didn't have a classified designation on it. She turned back to the window. Outside, in the hospital parking lot, a dark SUV she hadn't seen before was pulling into the visitor spaces. Government plates. 2 people in the front seat, 2 in the back. They weren't getting out. They were waiting. She watched them for a long moment. Kell, she said. Yeah, how many people knew you were back in this room? A beat of silence behind her. Bate, he said. Ferris. The 2 investigators on Ferris's team. The 4 people in the SUV still hadn't moved. And anyone Ferris's team reported to, she said. She turned around. Kell's expression had done something she hadn't seen it do before, which was compress into a kind of stillness that was different from his operational neutral, not the stillness of a man managing emotion, but the stillness of a man who had just recognized something and was moving all his resources toward understanding exactly what he'd recognized. His phone, the personal one, the one that should not have been in the room, buzzed on the table beside the bed. He looked at it. She crossed the room and looked at it with him. The message was from a number she didn't know, routed through a channel she didn't recognize. And it was not 4 words this time. It was a name and a room number and a timestamp showing 40 minutes ago. The name was Ferris. The room number was an operating suite on the 4th floor. 40 minutes ago was when Ferris had stopped being visible to anyone in the building. She moved first, not because she had a plan she didn't, not a complete one, but because standing still, while an investigator who had arrived at 9:0 a.m. with federal documentation had gone missing by 2:35 p. M was not a position she was willing to hold. She picked up Kell's personal phone, photographed the message on her own phone, and set it back on the table. The SUV in the lot, she said. I saw it. 4 people. Government plates. Waiting, not moving. She pulled up the image she'd just taken and looked at the message. Again, Ferris's name, the operating suite number, the timestamp. If someone inside Ferris's own reporting chain is connected to Blackstone's network, they'd know she was here. They'd know what she collected this morning. Kell had already moved the monitoring line to the side in the deliberate way of a man who was about to do something his body hadn't cleared him for. "Don't," she said. "Voss, you have a chest wound that is currently intact and will not remain intact if you walk another building circuit at 3 in the morning. I will go." She held up her hand before he could form the objection. "I work here. I have floor access. I have a reason to be anywhere in this building. You do not." She looked at him. "Tell me about Ferris. Who did she report to when she arrived this morning?" He thought for 2 seconds. Her direct contact here would have been the medical director's office. But the team she brought the investigators, they operate under a separate command authority, compartmented from standard intelligence hierarchy. Is the compartmentation clean? A beat. I thought so. But Blackstone's network reached into a SOC-adjacent channel once already, she said. The relay you gave me. Someone had access. His jaw tightened. The relay was the warning shot. If they had full access to the investigated division's internal communications, then they knew Ferris was coming before she arrived, Marlowe said. And they've had since 9:0 to figure out what she found. She picked up her badge from where she'd set it on the window ledge and clipped it to her scrub pocket and walked out. The 4th floor housed the surgical suites, 2 procedure rooms, and a recovery ward that ran at reduced capacity overnight. At 3:30 in the afternoon, it should have had moderate traffic pre-op preparation, post-surgical recovery checks, the ordinary operational movement of a medical floor doing its work. What she found when the elevator opened was a hallway that was almost entirely still, with a quality of stillness that was different from routine quiet because it had been produced rather than arrived at naturally. 2 nurses at the far station, both heads down, neither looking up when she stepped out. A facilities cart parked against the wall near the 2nd procedure room, with nobody attending it. She walked at her normal pace, the pace of a nurse with a destination, and she looked at the suite numbers as she passed them. The message had specified operating suite 4. It was at the end of the hall, behind a set of double doors with wire-reinforced windows. She looked through the glass before she touched the handle. Ferris was inside, sitting in a chair against the far wall. She was not restrained. She was not visibly injured. She was sitting with the specific tamed stillness of a person who had been told to stay where they were by someone with the authority to make that instruction binding. And she was looking at the door, and when she saw Marlowe, her expression shifted by 1 degree, not relief, something more complex than relief, the expression of a person recalculating a set of odds. Beside Ferris stood a man Marlowe had not seen before. He was in his 50s, in uniform, with the bearing of someone who had occupied senior positions, long enough that authority had become indistinguishable from posture. He was holding Ferris's tablet, and standing near the procedure table, with his back to the door, was one of the 2 investigators who had arrived with Ferris that morning. She pushed the door open. The uniformed man looked at her badge and then at her face with the immediate calibrating attention of someone who had been briefed on the people in this building. "This suite is restricted," he said. "Sensiusen. I'm the nurse assigned to this floor," she said, which was not precisely true for this floor, but was true for the building. And she said it with the complete, undefended calm of a person who had nothing to explain. "I was told there was a patient in recovery who needed vitals checked. There's no patient in this suite. Then I have the wrong room." She looked at Ferris, made direct eye contact for exactly the length of time it took to communicate. "I see you. I know what this is. I'm not leaving." Then she looked back at the uniformed man. "Who are you?" "Brigadier General Harlan Price," he said. "SOC Command Authority." "Are you Agent Ferris's commanding officer?" "I'm the commanding officer of the division that authorized her investigative team." She looked at Ferris. "Are you here voluntarily?" Price said. "This is an internal division matter." "I asked, Agent Ferris," Marlowe said, and she kept her voice at exactly the same temperature, because dropping it lower would have been a kind of aggression she wasn't ready to make visible yet. and raising it would have been a mistake. Ferris looked at her. I've been asked to pause the documentation transfer pending a review of collection methodology, she said, in the precise and careful language of a person choosing words the way you choose footholds on uncertain ground. General Price has concerns about the evidentiary chain of custody. Specifically, Price said, the statement collected by a civilian nurse with no current active clearance from a patient in a compromised mental state at 3 a.m. without authorized intelligence personnel present. She understood what was happening with complete and specific clarity. This was not a review. This was an interception. Price was not here because he had concerns about methodology. He was here because the documentation package that Kells Relay had transmitted at 4:15 a.m. had arrived somewhere. It connected to something connected to him, and he had moved to contain it before it finished moving through channels he couldn't control. Blackstone's network had not been one corrupt logistics officer. It never was. She looked at the tablet in Price's hand. That's Agent Ferris's device, she said. It's federal property under my command authority. It contains evidentiary material submitted by a principal witness in an active federal investigation. Removing it from the investigating agent's custody without a court order is she stopped because she was a nurse and not a lawyer, and she knew the limits of what she could credibly assert. But she also knew that the moment she stopped talking, the moment she ceded the floor, this room would close around Ferris and the documentation would go somewhere it wouldn't come back from. She needed 30 seconds. She pulled out her own phone, opened the image she'd taken of the message on Kells' phone, Ferris's name, the suite number, the timestamp, and she texted it to the only number she could think of that had any chance of producing the right result in the right time frame. She texted it to Bate. Then she looked at Price and said, I'd like to understand the legal basis for the review before anyone leaves this room. And she stood in the doorway with her hand on the doorframe. Not blocking it, she was one person, and Price had rank and the investigator near the procedure table, but present, occupying the space, making the situation harder to resolve cleanly by existing in it. Price looked at her with the expression of a man who had been a general for long enough that being contradicted by people below his rank had become a texture of his professional life rather than a shock, and who had developed for exactly that reason a very refined ability to identify which contradictions required engagement and which could be simply moved through. He was deciding which category she fell into. His phone rang. He looked at it. She watched his face, and what she saw on it told her more than the content of whatever the call said, because the content was something she couldn't hear from where she stood, but the face was right in front of her. It was the face of a man receiving information that revised his position from secure to contested, and the revision was not small. He answered, listened for approximately 20 seconds, said nothing, and ended the call. He looked at Ferris. He looked at Marlowe. He set the tablet on the procedure table next to where he'd been standing, set it down, stepped away from it, and he said, Agent Ferris, I'll need to speak with Division Counsel before we proceed. And then he walked toward the door, and Marlowe stepped to the side, let him pass, and he walked out without looking at her again. The investigator near the procedure table followed him. The double doors swung shut. Ferris stood up from the chair and picked up the tablet and held it against her chest with both hands. And for 1 second, just one, she let something show on her face that had not been there before, which was the expression of a person who had been holding a position under pressure for an unknown duration and had just been permitted to stop. Bate called someone, Marlowe said. Bate called 3 people, Ferris said, and her voice had a slightly different quality now, something that might eventually become dry humor once enough time had passed. I don't know who the third one was, but whoever it was apparently carries enough weight to make Harlan Price decide he needed legal counsel. She looked at Marlowe. How did you know where I was? Message to Kells' phone. Your name, this suite, the timestamp. Ferris's expression went very still. Who sent it? I don't know. The routing channel wasn't one I recognized. Someone wanted him to know, Ferris said, thinking it through in real time. Someone inside the network who knew what Price was doing and decided to put a flag on it. Is that possible? It's possible that Blackstone's network has people in it who didn't fully understand what they'd gotten into, Ferris said. Networks like this don't run on people who are all equally committed. Some of them are bought, some of them are pressured, some of them are 2 levels removed from the actual decision-making and only figure out what they're part of when it's already too late to leave cleanly. She looked at Marlowe, someone who knew Price's intentions, but wasn't willing to let Ferris disappear quietly since it sent that message. The implications of that settled in the room, alongside the antiseptic smell and the procedure light and the 2 chairs against the wall. What happens to Price? Marlowe asked. That depends on what division counsel tells him and how quickly our documentation reaches the right federal desk. Ferris moved toward the door, which is why I need to stop standing in this room. They walked out together, and Marlowe did not look like a person who had just interrupted a general, because she'd discovered a long time ago that the best way to look like you hadn't just done something significant was to keep moving at the same pace you'd been moving before you did it. What followed over the next 18 hours was not cinematic. It was paperwork and phone calls and the grinding institutional machinery of a federal investigation, finding its full momentum, which looked nothing like the way it felt from inside and made no concessions to the people caught within it. Ferris worked through the night in the medical director's office with a door that was now locked from the inside. Bate disappeared into a series of meetings she wasn't privy to. Kell was moved to a different room on a different floor with a security detail that Ferris Timmis had personally vetted, and Marlowe knew this because she was the one who checked his chest at 11 at 0 p.m. and found it intact and sat beside his bed for 12 minutes, not saying anything in particular, while his monitors ran their steady lines. Price, he said, at some point during those 12 minutes. Ferris is handling it. Is she? She doesn't need us to handle it for her. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know how to do nothing. I know, she said. Do it anyway. 3 days later, Brigadier General Harlan Price was placed on administrative suspension pending a federal conflict of interest investigation. The suspension was announced through a JSOC internal communication that was not made public, but the 3 journalists who covered the defense beat and had cultivated the right sources knew about it within hours, and the story that appeared the following morning in 2 national publications described an unnamed senior military official under investigation for potential compromise of Special Operations intelligence channels. The official was not named. The operation was not named. But the payment channel, the foreign-facing contractor, the 2-country shell structure, the transfer for timing was described in enough detail that the people who needed to know understood what they were reading. Ray was formally charged 11 days after his arrest. The charges were specific, documented, and public, deliberate compromise of active special operations personnel, conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, transmission of classified positional data to a foreign-connected network, and conduct unbecoming, which was the charge that carried the least legal weight, but seemed to matter most to the people who had served under him. The logistics officers who had processed the frequency change memo were identified, interviewed under immunity arrangements, and 2 of them provided testimony that extended the evidentiary record from one corrupt colonel to a structured operation that had been running for over 2 years. The codename Blackstone appeared in no public document. It appeared in the case file under a sealed index. Marlowe knew about it because she had been the first person outside Kell's direct knowledge to hear the name, and her statement was part of the record, and the record was something she had access to in her capacity as a civilian subject matter resource, which was the formal designation Ferris had at hand. Attached to her name in the investigative structure, with documentation that bore Bates' signature alongside Ferris's. She had not gone looking for that capacity. She had not applied for it, or campaigned for it, or maneuvered toward it. She had done what the situation required, one step at a time, starting with a piece of paper and a memory of a whiteboard from 14 years ago, and the capacity had formed around her actions, the way water forms around whatever is actually present, rather than whatever was planned. The two men from Kell's team who had been confirmed dead were publicly recognized 6 weeks after the investigation became official. Not with fanfare, the nature of their work precluded the kind of public ceremony that their families might have preferred, but with documented acknowledgement, formal military honors, and records that would no longer describe their final operation as a standard reconnaissance loss. What had happened to them was named accurately in their service records. The people responsible were named in the same document. That was not everything their families needed, but it was not nothing, and it was permanent. The one unaccounted for team member was recovered. Not quickly and not cleanly, nothing about the operation that had destroyed Kell's team had a clean resolution, but he was alive, and he was found, and the intelligence that led to his location came in part from the financial network that Ferris's team had been tracing since the morning she'd arrived at Harwick with a locked door and a 4-person team, and documentation that left no room for alternative responses. His name was not made public. His recovery was not announced. But Kell told Marlowe about it 3 weeks after it happened, sitting in room 312 for what would turn out to be the last time, and the way he said it told her more about what it meant to him than anything he could have said directly. He said, "They found Ortega," and then he didn't say anything else for almost a minute, and she didn't fill the silence, because some silences exist to be inhabited rather than resolved. The two missing were still missing. That did not have a resolution. It remained an open wound in the case file and in Kell's operational accounting of what had happened, and she understood by now that it would remain open and that some things could not be wrapped into a conclusion without lying about what they were. She had learned that a long time ago. She had simply forgotten it during 11 months of night shifts that were mostly manageable and occasionally terrible, and never quite this. Her military record was formally reviewed at the request of the investigative team, which had, in the course of building their evidentiary case, accessed her service history to verify the details she'd provided about her Army attachment. The review found that a disciplinary notation made in 2011 related to a decision she had made during a training integration exercise that had been classified at the time and remained classified, had been entered incorrectly and without proper authorization by a commanding officer who was no longer in service. The notation was removed. Her service record was corrected to reflect what had actually happened rather than what someone had decided it was more convenient to say had happened. She found it psychologically, professionally. She found out about this from a letter that arrived at her apartment on a Tuesday morning while she was drinking coffee and thinking about whether she needed to buy more rice. The letter was from the Army Records Command, and it was 2 pages long, and it said what it said in the formal, compressed language of an institution acknowledging an error without fully describing the error, and she read it twice and then set it on the kitchen table next to her coffee mug and looked at it for a while. She had carried that notation for 14 years. She had built around it the nursing degree, the civilian career, the careful positioning of herself within the boundaries of work that didn't require her to explain the parts of her service history that the notation had made complicated. She had not been broken by it. She had not stopped functioning. But it had been weight she carried in a specific way, redistributed into the architecture of her daily life so thoroughly that she had largely stopped being aware of it as separate from herself. Sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, she became aware of it as separate from herself. She was not sure whether to call that relief or grief or simply recognition. She decided it was probably all three, and that the taxonomy mattered less than the fact of it, and she finished her coffee and washed the mug and went to work. Drawl came to find her that afternoon, which was becoming a habit she had mixed feelings about. He stood outside the nurse's station with the specific body language of a man who had prepared what he intended to say, and was now finding that the prepared version required adjustment. "Your intervention documentation from the first night," he said. "I've been asked to provide a supporting clinical statement for the investigative record, confirming the efficacy of the approach and the accuracy of your assessment." He paused. "I want you to know that I wrote it accurately." "What does accurately look like?" "It looks like a physician stating, in formal documentation, that a nurse's clinical judgment was correct, and his own was not." He said it without flinching, which cost him something she could see, and that the outcome Sergeant Kell's survival, the recovery of his cognitive and physiological function, was a direct result of her intervention. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, turned, and walked away, and she watched him go and understood that people were capable of doing the right thing belatedly and imperfectly, and that this was not nothing. It was not everything, but it was not nothing. Kell was cleared for discharge on a Thursday, which was 31 days after he had arrived on a rooftop pad with oxygen saturation at 61% and a nervous system that had been trying to fight off a hospital. He walked out under his own power, slowly, with his right hand pressed lightly against his rib cage, in the way she'd watched him manage the chest wound since the loading dock, and Reyes was there to drive him. And Ferris was there with a final documentation question that she asked in the parking lot, because Ferris apparently had no sense of occasion, and Bate was there because Bate was always somewhere in the periphery of events that required his particular combination of skills. Marlowe was there because she was finishing a shift. She was not going to make it more than it was. She was tired and her feet hurt, and she had 32 hours of charting still outstanding from the past 2 weeks of investigation-adjacent chaos, and she was holding a paper cup of bad coffee and wearing yesterday's scrubs, and none of this felt the way she thought it might feel when she had imagined, at some point during the worst hours of the last month, that there would be a moment on the other side. Kell crossed the parking lot and stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a moment with the same direct attention that had stopped being uncomfortable and started being simply honest. "You saved my life," he said. She shook her head. "You were already fighting." "I just don't," he said, not harshly, but firmly, the way you stop someone from performing a version of themselves instead of being the actual thing. "You knew what I was doing with my hand. You knew what it meant. You knew how to reach me, and you stood in a room full of people who outranked you, and you refused to move." He paused. "You saved my life." "Let me say that." She let him say it. And then she said, "The JSOC resource attachment. Ferris's documentation. It's official. I know. I read it." She looked at the paper cup in her hand. "I haven't decided what to do with it. You don't have to decide today." "I know that too." She looked up at him. "Your team. The two that are still," she stopped, because there was no version of that sentence that didn't require more than she had to give it right now. "I know," he said, which was not a resolution, but was true. Reyes pulled the vehicle up. Ferris finished her parking lot documentation exchange and put her tablet under her arm and went back inside. Bate, from somewhere near the entrance, raised a hand in a gesture that was not quite a wave and not quite anything else. "What do you actually want?" Kell asked. Not in the context of the JSOC attachment, not in the context of the investigation. She understood the question as larger than both. After this, "What do you want?" She thought about it for a moment, honestly, without reaching for the answer that sounded right. "To do work that matters," she said, "without having to pretend I'm less than I am to do it." He nodded slowly. "That's a place to start," he said. He got in the vehicle. She stood in the parking lot and watched it go, and the cold came in off whatever weather system was building to the west, and the hospital behind her made its ordinary sounds an ambulance bay door, a ventilation system, the far-off beeping of something that was someone's emergency and someone else's routine, and she held the paper cup of bad coffee in both hands and stood in the ordinary, unremarkable morning of a city that was not quite Portland and not quite anything else, and she thought about what he'd said. That's a place to start. She had started there before. She had started in an Army recruiter's office at 22 years old, not because she knew what she was getting into, but because something in her had recognized, without having language for it yet, that she was the kind of person who ran toward the thing that other people stepped back from. She had started there again at 32, when she sat in a classroom full of nursing students who were 10 years younger than her and learned a version of medicine that was cleaner and quieter than the medicine she'd already practiced, and she had been grateful for the clean and quiet because she had needed it then. She was 38 years old, and she had a corrected service record and a formal designation as a civilian subject matter resource, and 32 hours of outstanding charting and feet that hurt, and the version of herself that had spent 11 months carefully staying within the boundaries of a nursing badge was not that a false version. It had been real, and it had been what she needed, and it was over. What she was, she had always been. The night shift had not made her smaller. The hierarchy had not made her smaller. The 14 years of carrying a notation that should never have been entered, had not made her smaller. It had all been weight distributed around something that was simply too structural to compress, and the weight had come off not all at once, not cleanly, not in a way that felt like a Hollywood moment, but incrementally over 31 days, in the process of doing the thing she was built to do. She finished the coffee. She threw the cup in the bin near the ambulance bay entrance. She went back inside. Theo was at the nurse's station, doing what Theo always did, which was his work with the uncomplaining competence of someone who had decided the work was enough of a reason. He looked up when she came in. "Kel discharged?" he asked. "Just now." He nodded, looked back at his chart. Then, "Are you staying on nights?" She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. "For now," she said. "I have some decisions to make." About the other thing. About the other thing. He looked at her sideways with the expression of someone who had watched the last month happen from close range and had drawn his own conclusions. "You're going to say yes to whatever they're asking." "I haven't decided." "You've decided," he said, without heat, without judgment, just the flat accuracy of someone who had been paying attention. "You decided when you walked back into the building at 3 in the morning instead of getting in that car." She picked up the chartboard and didn't answer him because he was right, and answering when someone was right rarely added anything. She started her rounds. The hallways were the same hallways. The nurse's station smelled the same. The work was what it had always been: specific, demanding, requiring the whole of her attention when she gave it her attention, which she always did. She was good at this work. She had always been good at this work. That had not changed and would not change, regardless of what else she imaged into it. But she was also the person who had read a tap sequence in the dark, who had stood in a room full of people with more authority than she had and refused to move, who had walked back into a building when every reasonable instinct said otherwise, who had written 11 pages of documentation by hand in the middle of the night and signed her name to them and meant it. She was the person who had always been that person, even when the people around her had decided she was something simpler. Especially then. There was a lesson in that, though she was too tired to articulate it with any elegance. Something about the gap between what people decided you were and what you actually were, how that gap didn't shrink you. It just accumulated quietly until the right situation arrived, and it became visible all at once. Something about how the most important form of strength was the kind that didn't require an audience to function. The kind that worked in the dark, in the margins, in the spaces between the important people where no one was watching. She had been in those spaces for 11 months. She had been in those spaces her whole career, really, in one form or another. And when the moment required it, the spaces had been exactly the right place to be. Her pager buzzed. A patient on the second floor needed a vitals check. She went.